Hello everyone, this is Rob Smith from Viva Farms, and we are back with Eric Olson from Well-Fed Farms. And we're going to be talking today about small-scale animal husbandry and specifically pigs. And we're going to be focusing on pig feed and sort of the components of making sure that pigs in an operation have the nutrition they need and are well fed, actually.
Well-Fed Farm.
Thank you so much, Eric, for being willing to talk with us today and
of course,
sharing your perspective.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
So Eric, what are the considerations in a feed program for your pigs?
Well, the first thing I think about is the health and well-being of the animals, whether or not the feed that they have access to is going to keep them healthy and vigorous, and whether or not it's going to help them grow optimally. That is, put as much weight on in the time span that we have to raise them out from weaner when they're small size to finish when they're ready to go to the butcher. We want to make it as profitable as possible, so we want them to grow as much in that time frame as possible. That's the primary consideration, but what you'll bump into if you decide to start a small scale pig business is, or a large one for that matter, is what's practically available. You may read in a book that it's optimal to raise pigs on a corn soy ration of this mix and this mix, but we live in a region of the country out here in Western Washington where corn and soy are not the main crops grown, nor are they really grown even on the east side where it's drier and conducive to that in any large scale. It's more of a wheat and grain sort of economy out there. So you can get corn and soy, but it might be more expensive and harder to come by. Other considerations have to do with how many pigs you are trying to feed. If you are just raising 2 pigs, kind of for a backyard homestead sort of arrangement, it wouldn't necessarily be prohibitive to assume that you might be able to feed them largely off of kitchen scraps, things you glean from area farms, restaurant scraps, that sort of thing. But if you're trying to raise 50 or 100 hogs, acquiring that much feed through that avenue might be tricky. I've heard of a farm down, I think in Nevada somewhere, but they compromise like the majority of their feed they own a couple dump trucks and they go around all the different restaurants on the Las Vegas Strip.
Wow.
And they pile all the feed in the back of the dump trucks. They take it out, and I think they raise about 800 pigs that way.
Wow.
That is a nice convenient synergy, but I personally would be kind of suspect of some of the things that are in that feed, how that's going to affect the nutritional content and the flavor of the pork.
Sure.
And so I would avoid it personally, but that's just where I'm at. What has worked for me as a grower is partnering with a local small scale mill, which we're lucky enough to have in this region. Not every place is going to have necessarily mills that would cater to a smaller grower like myself, but they've been willing to custom design a feed for me based around my considerations. When I first started the business, I was using certified organic feed, and organic grain prices specifically in the first couple of years took a very steep upturn. And my response to that, rather than to raise the price of my already expensive, relatively expensive pork, was to quit using certified organic feed, but to have Conway Feed, the mill I work with, design a feed for me that was GMO free. That was my primary consideration, and also of people I sold to, one of their main considerations. So anything that potentially would be a GMO ingredient like corn, soy, canola, so on and so forth, that would go into the feed, I told them if they're going to use that, source that organically. But if you're going to use wheat and barley, things that don't exist in this country in GMO fashion, it's okay to source that conventionally. And that balances the price, the specifics of the feed. And in working with a mill, especially this mill, which their customer service is great and their knowledge of feed is great, they gear the feed specifically to the nutritional requirements of pigs. They're depending on what sort of animal you're raising, you want feed that has a certain balance of protein, carbohydrates, certain vitamin and mineral profile, and they are able to adjust that based on what they add into the feed, so that it's pretty much like a one-stop shop. Everything the pigs need is in that feed, and then I can supplement with things that I have available this time of year. As harvest comes in, it's not uncommon for someone to call me up who knows that I raise pigs and say, I've got 500 pounds of apple pulp from a cider pressing. Do you want it? Yeah, totally. That's worth my while. I'll drive on with my pickup truck, load it in, and toss that to the pigs. And the other big component, obviously doing a outdoor pasture operation, is that we want the pigs to be foraging. Pigs are not, as you may know, ruminants. They're not cows, sheep, or goats, so they can't provide the majority of their nutrition through eating grass. However, they can get a lot of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, fiber, other things that will positively affect them in terms of their health, and also in the flavor and quality and nutritional value of the meat. By given relatively constant access to grass, clover. In this case, this is pretty cool. We have the last of a stand of wheat that Viva Farms planted for harvest, but didn't get combined for whatever reason this year, and so we just turned the pigs loose into that, and they're going to be able to munch on this, have some fun, give them something enjoyable to do, and also contribute to their caloric intake and to their overall health and well-being. So yeah, there's some synergies there, but what I have decided to go on as a grower has been very much dependent on what's available in my local area. If I didn't have access to Conway feed, I would potentially look around for another mill that could work with me in the same fashion. But in not finding it, I would be kind of forced to decide whether or not I wanted to try to source and create my own feed, which is a whole nother thing. Like growing your own feed is an entirely another business model, and you have to have, first of all, a lot of land for that, because pigs take a lot of feed. I think the conventional wisdom is to get 1 pound of pork, you need 4 pounds of feed to go into it. Every one of these animals is probably going to be around 300 pounds when it's slaughtered, so we're talking about 1,200 pounds of feed per animal.
That's over the life cycle.
Over the life cycle, yes, but still it's significant. So not only do you need land to grow the feed, but then you need the equipment that is necessary to grow it. So tractors, seed drills, combines, and then after you've harvested, you have to be able to process and store all that feed, which requires barn space and other things. So that's a pretty high bar. Some people do it, but they tend to be more established multi-generational farmers who already have land access, and probably aren't doing livestock as their primary thing. It might be like a side note. But it would be a cool thing to do, just not quite where we're at on this farm. People oftentimes who are interested in what I have to sell get really excited about feed, because one of the things you really run into these days is people who don't want corn and soy in their diet because they believe they have a sensitivity to it, and they ask, do you have any corn and soy in your feed? And it's like, well, there may be or there may not. I basically tell my mill that I want pig feed. And I tell them I don't want GMOs, and they take care of it. If they can source organic soy as a protein at a good price, they'll go for that. If it's not available, or they can get some organic flaxseed from up in Whatcom, at a better price, they'll use that instead. But it's kind of, they're like, I give them good business, but they also at the same time are kind of doing me a favor by working with me in my special request. And so I try not to be like, hey, can you do this and this and this? I'm like, I give them some leeway and trust that they're going to do what makes the most sense within my framework.
So does the feed change throughout the life cycle of the animals in terms of what you're feeding them and how much?
Well, pigs are mammals, and so they start life out on their mother's milk. But when I get the pigs, they have pretty recently been weaned off of that and are onto a grain-based diet. That being said, there have been years where I've had enough luck to have access to a pretty steady supply of milk. In one case, it was a local goat dairy that hadn't got certified to process and sell their milk, and so I was able to pick up, like a 50-gallon drum every couple days and use that as a way to kind of nurse them along, so to speak, for a while longer, and that worked out really well. However, not always a viable option. There may be milk available, but it may be, more work than it's worth to actually get it. And so I just kind of, for the sake of business planning, assume that as soon as I get the weaned pigs, that they are going to be transitioned onto a grain-based diet. We use the same ration from that early point in their life all the way through to their finish. Pigs are fairly versatile in terms of what they can eat and do well on. They're omnivorous. They are kind of like us in a way. Like in theory, we could live off Doritos and be okay. We may
Don't
not
try
be.
that at home.
We may not be as okay as okay would indicate, but we would survive, as would they. But we of course feed our animals a much healthier diet than that. It is grain-based. The mill we work with mixes the feed that they bring us to certain specifications. Most importantly, that it is non-GMO, doesn't contain any GMO ingredients. But aside from that, they go off conventional industry wisdom as to the protein level that the pigs need, which in this case is 15 to 16%. And they also significantly add a specific vitamin pack, as it's called. It's a mix of vitamins and minerals, micronutrients that pigs need for optimal health and growth. There are certain things, lysine is one, an amino acid that they can't synthesize on their own and isn't readily present in any of the plants or whatever else not that they have to forage. That if they don't have that, they'll survive, but they won't grow well. And so they add a pig-specific vitamin pack, Fertrell NutriBalancer, I believe in this case, to make sure that they have optimal health. But aside from that, it's pretty much up to them. I am very lucky to have a mill locally that is easy to work with. They've been responsive to my requests. Their customer service is great. Their turnover is great. I can literally call them, on Monday and say, hey, I need feed. And if they don't have it there Tuesday, they'll have it there Wednesday. So they're quick. They deliver. Their prices are pretty good and fairly consistent. And so I try not to be too picky. There are, a certain subsets of the food movement, the consumers who want specific things in their animal feed these days. There's a fairly large and growing subset of people who want animals that are fed on, say, corn or soy-free feed because they've noticed that they have sensitivities to that. That is in theory possible, but it is going to be an added cost and actually an added consideration for the mill itself if they're going to do that. At the mill, they have various bins, they would call them, large containers that they store the ingredients that they buy in. So they'll have one for wheat, they'll have one for barley, they'll have one for corn, one for conventional corn, one for organic corn, and so on and so forth. And they're fairly limited in that space, and so they could say, we could do a corn and soy free feed, but we'd have to consistently be stocking a soy-free protein. We already stock organic and non-organic soy. And if we wanted to get consistently organic flax, we need another bin, and there have to be enough demand for it. So we're asking them to work harder and kind of bend themselves more to do that. And that's not something that has become enough of a priority for me that I really want to, ask more of those guys.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's what we're sticking with at this point. Things may change in the future, but right now we're pretty happy with what we have. So that's great. Informs what I do.
And you had mentioned that, over the life of the animal, about 4 pounds of feed per pound of finished product. But so they're eating more the bigger they get, or is that pretty consistent throughout the
Indeed.
year?
Yeah, no, they definitely consume a lot more. When we start the animals out, they're probably anywhere between, I'd say the biggest ones come to us maybe at 25 or 30 pounds. You remember some of those little guys were like, what, 5 or 10 pounds? Like they can be pretty small when they're weaned. And when they're young, they don't really eat that much. The minimum delivery quantity we have for feed from our mill we work with is 2 tons. So early on, we'll get that 2 tons of feed, and we'll store it in 50-gallon barrels out of the sun and rain, so it keeps as well as possible without degrading and oxidizing. And it'll probably take us a little over a month to work through that. Now we're getting 3 tons of feed delivered at about 1 week intervals. So, and they still have another month to month and a half before slaughter. So it gets to a point where, we're really cranking through it.
Wow. What sort of infrastructure and resources are available in an area or a region in order to have a reliable source of feed?
Well, what is in theory necessary to have reliable sources of feed are, in my opinion, small scale, locally owned mills that are, willing and able to work with smaller farmers like myself. It also helps to have a local agricultural economy that prioritizes, at least in some sense, growing the basic feedstocks for animal feeds. We're lucky enough in this area that grains are a rotational crop for a lot of farmers, so there is, at least as a basis, a fairly good supply of wheat and barley that can be used as a bulk ingredient for feed. We don't have, in Skagit Valley, at least in Western Washington in general, to my knowledge, any particular crop that can serve as the protein component for feed. There used to be a lot of peas that were grown here, but that has pretty much completely been wiped out in like the past decade.
As infrastructure is left and farmers.
Exactly. No processors for peas, therefore farmers aren't going to grow peas, therefore no peas, therefore no pea as an ingredient for the feed. So it's kind of it's a group effort in a way. If there are mills that can provide feed for farmers like myself to grow small scale livestock operations, then small scale livestock operations are going to have a chance and opportunity to flourish. And if that happens, then there are going to be more customers for these mills, and they're going to be able to have a reliable source of income, and kind of you got to kind of work together. I think one of the most important things is to find your local suppliers and work with them and support them. What they offer may not be necessarily perfect like what you might envision in a totally ideal world, but if you can show like, hey, we're able to give you a significant quantity of business, they're going to start to say, hey, it's worth our while to maybe shift what we're doing a little bit, make custom feed blends, adjust our delivery logistics and things of that nature, and work with small scale growers.
Which in turn can increase the demand for those feedstocks, so that farmers are able to grow more of it, which sort of that's the whole nature. And we're lucky to live in a place where we have this intact agricultural economy. As it relates, certainly.
And a great illustration of it here, as you well know, this is kind of a cool thing, is that basically where we just moved these pigs onto now is the remnants of a wheat field at Viva Farms. It was planted as a cover crop last year, and a lot of it was allowed to go through to maturity. Just 2 weeks ago it was combined. And that wheat that was combined is being sold to Conway Feed, the mill that is making the feed that these pigs are eating. So later today, feed truck's going to come and dump grain into that feeder, which in theory, maybe not this time around, is going to be made from the wheat that was actually grown in this ground, but at least later in the winter.
And processed into a form.
Exactly. A pelletized feed that is easier for the pigs to eat and to digest than the raw grain material, although they do seem to be enjoying picking the seed off the
these pigs right now they're kind of cutting out the middleman, as it were. And we also want to support that middleman too, because that's it's not every day you're able to have this set up.
That's what we just described as a very elegant and beautiful solution, I guess you might call it, to problem how to feed pigs. It's not always going to be there, but it kind of gives you a goal, something to shoot for, and something that you could work into your brainstorming sessions as a grower as to how you might want to not necessarily do things next year or the year after, but over the course of a career and a lifetime, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, grow into and be able to accomplish. Yeah.
We've talked quite a bit about feed and the local mill and the importance of local infrastructure. Kind of turning a little bit to talking about pasture. Could you tell us about your kind of rotation and how you factor pasture into the life cycle of the animals?
Yeah, through trial and error, I've arrived at the equation. Doesn't always work out this way, but roughly I would shoot for 1 acre of pasture for every 15 pigs. This year I'm doing a little tighter than that just because of the ground that was available, although through our lease arrangement we've kind of been able to expand into ground that we hadn't originally planned, so we're getting closer to that. So a number of animals per acreage is my first consideration. And then also another consideration worth mentioning from a food safety standpoint and also from an organic certification standpoint is that when animals are on pasture, it is effectively, as you know, treated as an application of raw manure. Organic rules require a period of 120 days between the application of manure to the harvest of crops from that ground. That being said, I think myself and most of us would be comfortable with a longer window. So basically my rule of thumb is don't grow on it the same year that you have pigs on it. So where we have the animals this year is going to sit through the winter, and then next year will be worked up and potentially having someone crop on it, or might turn it into pasture or grow a filled crop like wheat again on there. That's what we're doing where the pigs were last year. That ground has been worked up a couple times, and in about a month now we're going to be seeding wheat into it, which is being done as a trial on my farm, basically to look in some way at the viability of growing some of my own feed for my animals as part of the cycle that I'm doing. Based on the number of pigs that I'm raising and the land that would require, I don't think it's ever going to happen, at least in this incarnation of the business, that I'm going to be growing all my own feed. But if we're able to create a rotational crop for ourselves, grow some of our own feed, and hopefully cut down on our feed costs in the process, and also increase the health of the land we're working prior to, rotating it back into vegetables, there are a lot of potential wins in that scenario. So that's something that we're trying to get a better handle on as we grow and delve further into this magical world of pork.